I'd like to talk about the most compelling Baldur's Gate 3 DLC theory to date, namely the theory of the Dark Sun. As you can see here, and if you've played through the game and have reached the epilogue, there is a note that Withers possesses, and on that note it reads the following, as you can see. A missive in Withers' hand, addressed to some unknown entity, though you understand the alphabet, the script, and the words themselves, the meaning eludes you. You glean only the impression of dark sun in white sky, and an offer, or perhaps a warning. Now, Dark Sun has a lot of connotations in the context of the Forgotten Realms, and I am going to take the full dive into the deep end of the conspiratorial DLC theory pool here and suggest that this is the DLC, the expansion that Larian are working on. But I need to explain why this is so compelling. Well, Dark Sun, in the context of Baldur's Gate 3, and more importantly in the context of the Forgotten Realms, is the symbol and the name of Cyric. Now, Cyric is a god, a very evil god, that has, at least in 5th edition, been largely forgotten. And he has a very long and storied history. And after this video is released, I fully intend on doing a deep dive into the history, the deification, as well as the personality traits and the many other attributes of this most malevolent of deities in a separate video, because I've covered many gods on this channel. I am very much looking forward to covering Cyric, but needless to say, he is an evil god that has had dealings with basically all of the important gods that are mentioned and are relevant to the story of Baldur's Gate 3. More importantly, he has been out of the loop for a while. So Cyric, historically, was a mortal, that's the brief synopsis, and he ascended to godhood during the time of troubles. He took on the mantle of 3 different gods, and it was after he ascended to godhood that the Dead Three, as they're now known, Bane, Myrkul, and Baal, took on that moniker of the Dead Three, because they weren't dead before that. Cyric had personally slain Baal by his own hand, albeit with a sword that was the Avatar of Mask, a separate story, and Myrkul and Bane perished during the time of troubles. And so Eu the Overgod gave Cyric greater godhood in the form of bearing the mantle of all these 3 deities. So in the wake of the time of troubles, in late 1538 Dale Reckoning, Cyric was in fact one of the most powerful evil gods in all the Forgotten Realms, being the god of strife, the god of death and murder, as well as the god of the dead, inheriting these titles from these deceased deities. Now, as you know, the Dead Three eventually come back, and Cyric also appears in Baldur's Gate 2 Throne of Baal, if you weren't aware of that. So he's had many dealings with the Dead Three subsequently. Bane eventually resurrects himself, and there's a lot of strife and tension between the Church of Bane and the Church of Cyric. Myrkul doesn't like him, and well, Baal, of course, Baal eventually reclaims the mantle of murder from Cyric, but that takes quite a while, and as it is obviously the case, there is no love lost between these 3 evil deities and this one evil deity, Cyric, who is extremely malicious, extremely evil, and by some reckoning quite insane as well. So Cyric has direct ties to the Dead Three because he inherited all of their portfolios subsequent to the time of troubles, and lost almost all of their portfolios, save for the portfolio of strife, which he retained. The Dead Three are important in the context of Baldur's Gate 3, as you know, assuming you've played through the game. But it doesn't just stop there. Cyric is very close in many ways to the goddess Mystra, and this is because before Cyric became a god, and before the current incarnation of Mystra became a goddess, they were both mortals, and they were friends with each other. But Cyric betrayed Mystra, as well as somebody else, who's Kelemvor, who later becomes the new god of the dead. That's a long story for a separate time. And so already as mortals, there's bad blood between them. And if you fast forward to their state of godhood, Cyric is constantly trying to undermine Mystra. In fact, Kelemvor and Mystra used to be lovers, and Cyric managed to destroy and shatter the love between those gods. And, like I said, this is not the official video for Cyric, but long story short, Cyric murders Mystra in 1385, which results in the Spell Plague, that period of time in the Forgotten Realms when magic ceases to function. So Cyric has always had it in for Mystra. They've clashed as mortals when he betrayed her, clashed on multiple occasions as deities throughout their tenure of godhood, and eventually Cyric kills her. And so there's a lot of bad blood between Mystra and Cyric, and interestingly enough, the only explicit mention of Cyric in the game, as far as I'm aware, at least until we get to the epilogue with the god of song Milil, who makes explicit mention of Cyric, is that story that Gale tells you, Gale, who's a devotee of Mystra, if you decide to rescue the goblin in the cage in the druid camp, whereupon Gale will regale you with a story about a cleric of Cyric. But Cyric and Mystra have a long history of bad blood with each other, and again, directly related to a goddess who's very important in the context of the game, just as he's important to the Dead 3 for the reasons I mentioned before. But the connection of Cyric to various gods doesn't stop there. As you know, Shar plays a very important role in the game, with respect to Shadowheart specifically, because she starts off as a cleric of Shar, and guess what? Cyric also has a relationship to Shar. Specifically, it is rumored and almost certain that Shar manipulated Cyric into murdering Mystra, which is to say Cyric was her pawn, and Cyric resents her for that, and has resented her ever since for that manipulation. Now, it's true that Cyric wanted to murder her regardless, but Cyric didn't enjoy being manipulated. Again, there's a connection between Cyric and Shar. And the final divine connection in the context of Baldur's Gate 3 is the connection between Withers, aka Jurgle, the scribe of the dead, and Cyric. What is the connection there? Well, as many of you might know, and I talked about this in my video about Jurgle, and I will be reprising the topic of Jurgle and Withers as a topic in the future, but nevertheless, as you know, Jurgle originally was the god of death, the dead, tyranny, etc. He stepped down, and he seeded his portfolio and divided it up amongst the Dead 3, Bane, Myrkul, and Baal. Now, when he stepped down, he became a seneschal, a servant to the god of the dead. At the time, Myrkul. He became known as the scribe of the dead, as a kind of record keeper and servant. When Myrkul was slain, Cyric became the god of the dead, and of course Jurgle was forced to serve Cyric for quite some time. And to be perfectly honest, Jurgle, aka Withers, does not like Cyric. In fact, Cyric abused him repeatedly when he held the office of god of the dead, and for that reason, as well as other reasons, because Jurgle did not think that Cyric was a very good or efficient god of the dead, so to speak, Jurgle, Withers, does not like him very much. And there we have multiple divine connections to multiple gods in the context of Baldur's Gate 3, and the mention of a dark sun. Why would they mention the dark sun? Larian knows full well what they're doing here. You know, dark sun is a reference to the god Cyric. And the final piece of evidence I will adduce here, and I think it's very important, is that Larian likes stories about the gods and the interactions of the gods with mortals. As many of you know, the Divinity games, Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2, revolve heavily around divine power and the notion of divinity itself. And if you think about it, no fewer than 3 of the origin characters have deep connections to some kind of divine character. First and foremost, of course, Shadowheart, who starts off as a cleric of Shar, but also Gale and his tumultuous and complex relationship with the goddess Mystra, and even to a lesser degree, Lae'zel and Vlaakith. Now, Vlaakith is not a true deity, but nonetheless, the relationship Lae'zel has to Vlaakith is very similar to that of a worshipper to a deity. And so, it isn't a stretch at all to think an expansion or DLC they're working on might again be related to the gods. And to buttress this point, it's important to mention that Cyric was actually imprisoned, in theory, for 1,000 years by several greater powers after he murdered Mystra. And there hasn't been much mention of him, save for a few occasions in certain circumstances. And so, this could be the perfect opportunity for a comeback for the god Cyric, because he hates the Dead 3, he hates Mystra, he doesn't like Jurgle, and he resents Shar. All of these gods have something to do with him in some capacity. And why else would they talk about a dark sun? All in all, I can say I'm fairly convinced of this. Maybe I've convinced you. And expect in the not too distant future a follow-up video related to the god Cyric, about his history, about his past, and how he might fit into the plot of a Baldur's Gate 3 expansion. Anyway, as always, thank you for tuning in. If you like my content, you can leave a like, comment, share, subscribe. Really helps out the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.